I sort of want to just make sure everybody understands what this meeting is going to be. Rita's going to take us through the budget in detail. What I want to make sure everybody knows is that this is laid out in 3 parts, all right? The first part is going to be just the operating budget, okay? It's the HOA dues and the budget to run the building. That's it. That's what it is. We're going to move that into what we think, what we believe is the things that the building needs from a capital perspective. We're going to talk a lot more about that and what that means later on. With respect to the HOA, what you're going to be asked to do in the annual meeting is to approve or reject it, okay? The board has approved it. The finance committee has made a recommendation. We've gotten together several times. We looked through a lot of data. The finance committee recommended a budget, and the board unanimously approved that budget. So that's the budget, okay? Your job as owners is to accept or reject that budget. The second thing that we're going to be asking for your consent to do, which requires 2/3 of the owners to consent to, is going to be a declaration about an initiation fee. Okay, that declaration, everybody has to determine whether or not it's the right thing for them or not. And if they believe, if we do a good enough job of saying why we need something like that, we as a board have unanimously agreed to put that in front of this group to consent to. The third thing is something relatively new we weren't planning on, but it happened. It happened because of something that came up at one of the Meet the Candidate meeting. It has to do with compensation for the resident board members. Okay, so you're going to see a bylaw change that provides compensation, a minimal compensation in the form of a credit to resident board members. You're being asked to approve that or not approve that. So those are the 3 things that are going on in the annual meeting. Okay, is everybody good on that? Okay. So a couple of things, a couple of other things that I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew. We looked at a lot of different things, and in looking at those things, you know, there were a couple of, I'm going to call them guardrails that were important to the finance committee. There was one, we made a commitment last year, right? We looked at a 5-year plan, and we thought that the increase that we should be anticipating was about 5% this year, right? So that was in the package last year. We also, you know, are concerned about the burden that something like that presents to people, okay? Because it's a burden. But in addition to that, what we know has also happened that we didn't know is that inflation, right? If you look at the last 12 months, based on the October reports, inflation was 7.7%, right? So we had that impact from inflation. And further to that, we know that the COLA, the increase that the government has approved for the homeowners for Social Security is about 8.7% next year, right? So those were sort of backdrop to a decision that we made, which is in your package, and you already know it, which is the recommendation that the Finance Committee made was a 5.5% increase. We're going to go through that in detail, as opposed to trying to push the envelope on things that we didn't think were going to be affordable. So that's important. Lastly, and I want to make sure I say this, you know, right, whatever. Lastly, it's just important to know, for you guys to know that while we put out a message to everybody that said, we want questions in writing before the meeting, it doesn't mean that we're not gonna take questions either during the meeting or after the meeting that aren't written in advance. The purpose of writing those questions in advance is because we want everybody to be heard. Anybody with a question should be allowed to be heard. Sometimes there are folks that dominate the conversation. And unless other people have an opportunity to have their question in, sometimes that question doesn't get answered. So again, we're not gonna not have questions asked, and we'll take those questions so long as they pertain to the budget, and we'll answer those questions as best we can. Okay, but the reason for putting them in writing in advance is so that everybody has an opportunity. So with that, I am going to turn the budget meeting over to our executive director, Rita Long.
So the following presentation is an informational and contains recommendations being made to the association. Management and the board feels this presentation is crucial to the owners so you can make an informed decision when it comes time to vote at the annual meeting. It is important to know that recommendations being made to the association will not change as a result of this meeting. The Finance Committee, which consisted of Bill Thaxton, not sure if he's here, Scott Goins, the board and myself, worked through this plan and feel we are on the right path to reach our goals in which we started laying out in the 2021 annual meeting for 2022 and beyond. The parts to this presentation are our guiding principles, how we spent your dues in 2022, what we are trying to achieve in 2023, our FY22 forecast and our FY23 spending assumptions, how our operating budget and capital relate to each other, the budget recommendation being made by the board, our capital plan consideration, the bylaw amendment that Brian mentioned, as well as the declaration change. If you're following along in the package that you received, we are going to begin on page 2. As the committee started the process this year, we wanted to focus on our financial goals and getting to the marker in which we wanted to be. We all understand the challenges in the last 12 months with inflation, and while we don't have a magic wand, we foresee a more steady stream in 23. As stated in 21, our goal is to cover our HOA expenses and fund the reserves with our HOA dues while continuing to improve every amenity wanted by most owners and residents, including dining, activities, fitness, and our new improved personal care center. We also need to focus on other sources of income, such as the initiation fee, which Scott Carrier will talk about later in the presentation. We also have to continue to better manage costs so that we can have a more robust reserve to improve the crucial areas in the building as well as the physical amenities. As we continue to monitor the economic indicators, a more robust reserve allows us to better sourcing options for capital improvements. As a note, the 10-year T-bill, which sets the benchmark for borrowing, is currently 4% versus around 2% a year ago. We also planned for a 5.4% CPI and got 7.7, which was higher at times in the last 12 months. We've done well in some areas, such as funding the operational expenses with our HOA dues, although we didn't quite get there all the way because we also wanted it to fund our reserve deposit. It went a long way. If you recall, in 2021, we stated that was our goal by 2024. We did better controlling costs in departments such as resident accountability and water-related damage, which allowed us to recover cost. Because of the revitalization in our personal care center, we were able to increase our revenue by $624,000. And last but not least, we have begun a master planning for our 36-year-old building. Now, I know that may raise many eyebrows, but the way I look at it is how can we take a 36-year-old facility and focus on lifestyles such as the internet, more convenience, and the quality of life by continuing to place a Band-Aid and act as if we're experts in every field. We simply can't. To me, a master plan doesn't mean that we're going to go paint the building black, white, purple, green. It means that we are making connections between the buildings, the social settings, and the surrounding environment. No matter how well we've done in some areas, there's always areas that we may need improvement in. We were not able to manage the food industry's spiraling costs, such as labor, and the need to secure consistent staff, which would have enabled us to utilize the point of sale system in the dining room to allow for a more efficient service. Another big hit was utilities. We budgeted for a 5% increase, but thus far have been hit with a 21% increase. We will slightly go into how we are actually billed for this later in the presentation. Another big hit is the fact that our website was not the tool that we anticipated on it being. It continues to be a work in progress. I, like many of you and your relatives, would like the website to be more robust and being able to be used for placing work orders, placing food orders to the dining room, placing housekeeping orders so that we may be more efficient. And last but not least, we were not able to execute on any capital improvements, but are looking forward to the capital presentation in the first quarter of 2023. Moving to page 3. So where do we spend your dues? In 2022, 40.6% of the dues went to food, beverage, and service, which includes wages and supplies for dining and celebrations. We'll come back to this topic when we get to the forecast and spending assumption. 16% is paid out on maintenance, utilities, and housekeeping. 4.1% is allocated to activities, events, and transportation. 29.6% is spent on administration of MVT business, front desk, billing, and accounting. 9.4% is devoted to keeping our PCC available and operational. So page 4, we laid out our foundation and our guiding principles. What is it that we're trying to achieve in 2023? We're trying to ensure that we increase our capital reserves, better manage cost and quality in the dining room. Although I believe our cost expectations may not be realistic, we still expect great quality and consistent service. Again, I can't say this enough, but we should aim to cover our operating expenses and our capital reserve deposits and have a month of buffer with our HOA dues. We need to better brand and market and have a more mobile-friendly website to be more efficient in utilizing the tools that I mentioned earlier. And number 5, to boost professional fees to support long-term planning. Now on to the big one, page 5. Our FY22 forecast and spending assumptions in 23. As you can see, our overall cost we anticipate to increase by 3%. So let's break it down a bit. Employee expenses, non-dining. The contract labor line item. We began utilizing contract labor in the personal care center as the census in that department started to increase after our revitalization. We also use contract labor in other areas such as maintenance and housekeeping, but mostly PCC. These costs have previously been in the total employee cost, but I have broken them out for visual purposes. These employees are contracted with us at a rate that is not a temporary rate, and it is for a specific period. It is renewable if we wish to do so. And it also gives us the luxury of having the same staff members reporting every day, whereas temporary labor does not. I know the key for this in the personal care center is it's nice to always see the same staff. It's nice to always see the same residents. But you know what? One day we found ourselves not having any residents in the personal care center. So therefore, we were in a position to lay off employees. And then when the revitalization process started in November of 2021, we were in a position to bring back employees. And while the workforce labor was down, we turned to the contract labor, which has worked out very well for us. In the event this would happen again, we would simply let the contract labor go for other contract work they may have. In saying all that, the contract labor allows us to be more flexible at a very good rate for us. The increase of $56,000 in employee expenses is a small cost of living increase and includes one additional employee in administration. Moving on to administrative expenses. We anticipated insurance increase as we do every year, although not as large as the last couple of years because we've not had any claims in 2022. By the way, this is the first year in 5 years we have not had any insurance claims. Everybody knock on wood.
Whoa.
The increase in professional service is to cover things like marketing, including the website, consultants such as those that we are using for the internet, architects if needed, and so forth, with the overall increase in admin expenses increasing by $42,000. Utilities, I mentioned earlier, we are roughly 21% over budget for electricity, as we don't see that changing, so the line item for that has been adjusted accordingly. Several of our retired CPAs have asked why do we not negotiate a contract with Georgia Power? So I started investigating it. And our electric bill is split into two bills. We get one bill for the service center, which covers everything from the front door all the way back to the sun porch. The second bill covers everything in building A and B, which is the condos and the common areas. The large increase that we've been facing in the bill is the one that covers the condos and the common areas and building A and B. And speaking with the business department recently, our year runs from April to March. During that year, Georgia Power takes the highest 30-minute peak and bases our kilowatt hours off of that highest 30-minute peak for the next year. It also determines our demand rate off that number. And due to the number of kilowatt hours we use, we're automatically dumped into a commercial rate. I can tell you that our highest rate in 2021 to 2022 increased by 540 kilowatts. That means that our rate in 2021 was being based off of 460 kilowatts. In 2022, our highest 30-minute period peak was 1,000 kilowatts. After much consideration of the information that the Georgia Power representative provided me, I'm still not really satisfied and seeking further counsel from a business representative in that field. With that being said, that is why our utility rate is increasing by $55,000. Maintenance and housekeeping. Over the last week, I've had a few questions about what a VertiPack is, why it fluctuates from year to year from those of you that have been here a while. The VertiPack is the heating and cooling unit that is in your condo. In 2018 and 19, we ordered 75 units for those 2 years, which costed us $102,000. We sent a maintenance employee to HVAC school so he could repair the units as needed, and we were able to cut down on the amount we were ordering each year. In 2020 and 2021, we only ordered 20 units at a total of $31,000, which saved us $71,000. In 2022, we ordered 15 units, but now we are seeing a lot of the older units less repairable, so therefore that is why we are budgeting for 25 units in 2022, and you see that variance. On to repairs. Many of you should recall the line item that we've always called unplanned and extraordinary, and the exorbitant amount of expenses dumped into that category each year. The reality is if it occurs each year, it's really not unplanned, right? And so in 2021, we accepted the fact that these issues are going to happen and should be budgeted rather than unplanned. And so we increased our repairs category to cover such items. And you'll see that we narrowed the gap from the previous year of $400,000 in that category to $39,000. And so in 2023, we again increased our repairs category to cover these items as well as items that we know are going to hit next year, such as our boiler service repair, replacing more valves, our switchgear maintenance in the electrical room, and resurfacing the main driveway and circle as we do every 5 to 6 years. So that is why our increase in maintenance is $72,000. Last but not least, our dining services. As this is a complex topic, there's a lot of variables at play in this section. Before I start this section, I want to say this conversation is about the budget and what's driving the financials. The issue of whether or not we have the right vendor in food service or we are going in the right direction is not a conversation to be brought up today, but in the future at a board meeting or at an annual meeting if you as an owner wish to do so. In saying that, everyone knows that our food cost has been rising in Georgia alone. If you look at Sandy Springs, the cost for our area is above the national average for food away from home. The national average is 8.6. Okay, well, Sandy Springs is 12.7. We've had extreme pressures on the cost of food over the last year, but the biggest pressure for us has been in wages. Wages have gone up 8.4% in the last year. If you also look at the amount of employees available pre-pandemic, the month before Mount Vernon Towers shut down, the average number of employees available was 507,000. It got as low as 285,000. When we opened the dining room back up in March of 2021, the hospitality workforce was down 15% in Georgia. We've had to pay the gap by using temporary labor because there wasn't enough people in the workforce. But there is hope. In September, we see it reaching a more pre-pandemic peak, which provides us relief from the temporary labor companies that have gouged us for a year. This is important because it eliminates all the excuses. No more excuses that we can have. We should be able to be fully staffed, be able to train and maintain the level of service and consistency that we all desire as diners, no matter where we go. And utilize and learn the point of sale system to be more efficient with order taking and the execution of meals at the expedition line, which at the end of the day will create a better experience for everyone. So how does all this relate to the budget? Well, the great thing is we see a turnaround. Of course, our expectations will increase for our current food service vendor, maybe not overnight, but for sure gradually. And I believe this. I believe the economics are right in this budget. We are betting on food costs not continuing to rise. The inflation rate of 12.7% in Sandy Springs is all of last year. It's not saying it's going to be all of next year. And looking at the economics, it does not feel that next year we'll have the same circumstances to support that kind of inflation again. Also, as an alternative to increasing the cost and dues even more, we felt it appropriate to increase the meal prices to cover the gap for the total cost of putting a meal on the table. And by the way, breakfast and lunch meal rates here have not increased since 2017, and dinner prices here have not increased since 2020. And it's definitely more expensive today than it was in 17 and 20. Like I said, the workforce has increased, and that is why it has reduced our temporary labor line item. And although it has increased our compensation line item, it is still an extreme savings when compared. The cost of labor for Morrison's is down 14% in the third quarter versus the second quarter, and is at its lowest after finishing the first month of the fourth quarter. Food costs have remained steady, and we don't expect them to rise beyond what we've already seen. And so, after taking all the data and analyzing it, we feel that the overall decrease in the dining budget of $84,000 is appropriate for 2023. So back to where did your dues go in 2022? Yes, dining was 40.6% in 22. We're looking at 35% in 23. in coming up with the dining budget, we used data, analyzed it, looked at the run rate, and felt it more appropriate to budget accordingly, considering that. All that's left at the end of the day in the formula is that a good meal is provided and service is executed. That was a lot of information, but I felt that it was important to expand in that area because that is the biggest area that consumes your HOA dues. So our total operating expenses in 2022 was $4,695,000, and the assumption for 23 is $4,836,000. So in the end, we fully expect expenses to increase by 3%. Moving on to page 6. The Finance Committee reviewed several options for the 2023 operational and capital needs. We looked at everything. When the committee first began brainstorming, we wanted to determine what it was going to take to cover our HOA dues, to cover our operating expenses with our HOA dues and our reserve deposits. We looked at options that included increases as high as 14.8%, 12.9%, and everything in between. And without a doubt, the committee agreed that although we wanted to reach our goal in 23, that we would stick to what we said we would reach it in, which was 24, because those type of increases were way too much to consider. We then looked at the recommendation on what the budget was and what we have out there in capital to deal with in terms of spending. Spending for our capital projects comes from the reserves, either by way of transfer from reserves to operating to write a check, or by using it to secure other financing options. So in looking at the options, we said, okay, where will we be if we do nothing? Where will we be if we just do the 3% expected to increase the operating expenses? The committee hemmed and hawed, probably for 2 hours, about what the number should be, what the number could be, what was affordable, what was the right message, and that range came in between 4.5% and 8.7%, which was the inflation rate at the time. The committee voted on the more affordable number, which is the 5.5%, which will get us halfway to our goal. So let's break down what we're seeing here on page 6. In 2021, our operating expense was $4,712,000. In 2022, it was $4,695,000. In 23, we expect to spend $4,836,000. If we go with option 1 and did nothing, or if we go with option 2 and only cover the 3% needed, we wouldn't have anything left over from the HOA dues to deposit to the capital reserves. Now remember, the board approved earlier this year to increase the reserves from $15,000 a month to $20,000 a month, which is $240,000 a year. Going into option 3, which is the 5.5% increase, we automatically cover operating expenses and deposit $124,000 in the reserves from our dues, which is halfway to our commitment of $240,000. It does not get us where we want to be, which was set out to fund the operating expenses and our capital reserves, but it gets us closer to the 2024 goal, which we said that's where we wanted to be last year. So what happens with the other income that we generate? Other income invests in capital improvements and capital needs. It's basically money held in the reserves until it's spent. How do we generate other income? It's generated from operations such as administrative income, extra meals and dining, parties that we might have enough charge, our personal care center, and our maintenance work orders. In 2021, we had additional income of $647,000. At that time, we only had $144,000 in the operating a bank account, which is less than 1/2 month's expense. We did not cover all of our operating expenses with our dues, so we had to take $334,000 of that $647,000 to cover the gap. Then we had to pay out the deferred comp obligations. And our accounts payable was $75,000, which we're always going to have an accounts payable at the end of the month. There was nothing left to go in the reserves in 2021. At the end of 2021, our reserves balance was $1 million. In 2022, we had an additional income of $1,095,000. And because we were able to cover the operating expenses with our HOA dues, we have $466,000 sitting in the bank, which is a buffer to cover 1 month of our operating expenses. We covered our deferred comp. We were able to pay back the $160,000 from the capital reserves that was borrowed in March of 21. We were able to cover $120,000 in capitalized items such as fryers for the kitchen, HVAC unit for the sun porch, HVAC unit for the admin office, and other items such as that. We were able to pay our accounts payable of $48,000, which left us $210,000 to deposit to the reserves, which brought us up to $1,400,000 in the reserves. So if you look at our 5-year capital plan, you'll see the large difference between the $1.4 million in reserves and the number we're trying to get to. And that's why it's important to build the reserves. If we look at option 1 and do nothing, sure, it increases our capital reserves to $1.7 million, but the bottom line is 22% less than the recommended option. Again, look at the 5-year capital plan and the number in which we would need to get to. Moving to page 7, which is the final board recommendation. The recommendation being made to the association, which is illustrated as option 3, is a 5.5% increase. This recommendation allows us to cover the operating cost with HOA dues. It allows us to deposit $124,000 into the reserves from our HOA dues, which is half the committed reserve amount of $240,000. Have a 1-month buffer in the bank of $425,000. Pay our deferred comp obligation, and pay our accounts payable that we'll always have at the end of the month. It then allows us to make an extra deposit into the reserves in the amount of $531,000. For all the words I've just said, to me the beauty is looking at the bottom line of the reserves count. $1 million in 2021. $1.4 million in 2022. And what could be $2 million in 2023. That will mean that we will have doubled our reserves in 2 years from the year 2021 to 2023. You can think about that, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian to go over the capital consideration plan.
Okay, so what I want to point out is, here's what the board has approved, right? $2 million in the reserve. The reserve doesn't belong to the board, okay? It belongs to you guys. All that money in the bank is yours. Okay, it's not mine, it's yours. Okay? But likewise, you have a bill coming. That bill is $5 million. All right? Because we live here. We have a 36-year-old building. Okay? We have to fix it. And we have to do the things that are necessary to do. So these aren't random numbers. They may be rounded numbers. They may be approximate numbers. But we've taken bids on Chase. We've taken bids on generators, and we know what it's going to cost, or we at least have bids for sealing and caulking the building. All right, so these are not random numbers. They're approximate numbers, and they're rounded for the benefit of not having a 617 at the end. Okay, but this is what we believe over the next 5 years we're going to spend to get to the building of things like Chase, right? We talked about that. Sealing and caulking so that we don't have water damage. We know the HVAC units on the top of the roof. We know that they need to be repaired and replaced, all right? And, you have all these things. I know that there are people on the 3rd and 6th floor who want their floor renovated, okay? It's not unknown to the board. But we know when we did the last 2 floors, it was $350,000. We know that for a fact, okay? So now go to the slide. Because I'm just putting in perspective what gets in the reserve versus what we actually are working with. So we don't have enough money in the reserve to cover those costs. Over time, we would get there, right? Because if you look at how much we've accelerated the reserves, you can see that we can get to the numbers we need to get to. We just haven't focused on it in history. We are focusing on it for the last couple of years. It's been a planning process to get here, okay? But just to look at a couple of things, we're going to put in front of you, and Scott's going to talk about the initiation fee. It's a way to, it's something that's common in real estate here, in terms of these types of facilities. Well, we want to get that too, because we know it generates money for our capital reserve, okay? We want to, we have a small need to increase the price of meals. Okay, hey, look, I know, $7.50 is great, $8.50 is good, $9.50 for dinner. I can't go to Chick-fil-A and get it. Okay, so it as a modest increase, $1 on breakfast, $1 on lunch, $1.50 on dinner. In brunch, we want to increase, but we want to make brunch better. Right, we want to make brunch more robust. And we're going to start to do that now, as opposed to, we're going to let you see it first before we actually come to that increase in the brunch. We're going to make it worth it, okay? And so, when you look at those types of changes, you can see how it gets money into other income or capital reserve. Lastly, there's a ROI, there's a return on any investment that we do, right? So if I fix something so that it doesn't break, I don't have to spend that money. So when your ROI is good, when your return on investment is good, you can benefit from that. And while these aren't the most spectacular numbers, I just wanted to point out this water mitigation issue, okay? Water mitigation, in the last basically 3 years, we had to insurance paid out claims of $106,000 on them. Mount Vernon Towers carried the bill for $230,000. Okay? Our insurance premiums went up by $110,000. So the cost of water problems was $400,000, over $100,000 a year for water. That's all we're talking about. Okay? So if we do things like sealing and caulking the building envelope, right? It may cost us $600,000, but over the years, that will return our investment. Okay? So that's why these things are pointed out here. But let's talk about capital for a second, because there's also confusion about capital. What does the board get to do? What doesn't the board get to do? All right? What's in a capital plan? What I know is what I showed you on the last page was all the different things that we know about. What's on this page are probably the most immediate things that we have to deal with, right? We've been talking about the chases for a year and a half, all right? Sealing and caulking the building, we know we've got to do that. We know that we have to replace and repair, that this is the year that we're gonna have to do the air conditioners. I saw you shake your head on floor 3 and 6, right? We have to get to floor 3 and 6. You know the sad thing? I'll just make a point about the sad thing about floor 3 and 6, okay? Is that because we didn't have money in our reserve, okay? Because of the way we were financing ourselves, our operation, do you know why 3 and 6 aren't done? Because you lost in a pick from the hat, right? We picked from a hat. How sad is that?
When are you gonna make it up to us?
Okay? But that's what happened. Okay, you got the short straw. But no, we don't want that. Okay, we're trying to get to the place that we need to be in order for that not to ever be the case. So just in doing that, we know we have 2 million, or I'm sorry, if we approve the budget, we expect to have 2 million by the end of the year. By the end of next year, by the end of this year, we'll have 1.4 million. Okay? So here's why I'm not asking anybody to vote on a capital plan right now. We're gonna have a special meeting about the capital plan, because we can vote right now. Okay? And if we vote right now, I'm gonna ask you to cough up a check for $16,672. Okay? Because $16,672 times 299 units gets us our money. Okay? I can take $1 million out of the capital reserve and we can bring that price down to 13,000. Anybody want to write a check for 13,000? No. Okay? So we have got some work to do. What we want to do, what we need to do, all right, is we need to know what our budget is. We need to know whether or not we're going to get additional income from a declaration on initiation fees. All right? Once we do this, we've already done some, what I would consider to be schedules of, depending on how much we have, how much we get, we can watch the assessment of what would be a special assessment sort of go away over time, get smaller, because at the end of the day, the way we're operating the business is to create that funding for the capital reserve so that we can pay for these things. And we'll catch up, right? Because if you look at those numbers, if you think about doubling the capital reserve because of what we did so far, 3 years, there's another 500,000, 4 years, another 500,000. I think, actually go back to the slide 9, Clay, if you would. No, go back to slide 8. Right? What you can see is we're throwing off about $500,000 into the reserve based on that budget. Okay? I don't have to do that again to get that number. To get that 500,000. I don't have to do it again. I don't have to repeat it. The only thing that I want to do here going forward is just try to keep up with the CPI, whatever that's going to be, right? Whatever the cost is going to be. All right, so we know that we can create $500,000 in reserve every single year that can go towards paying down any debt we have. Go back to that slide again. The important thing is that the issue that we really face here is not whether or not we can afford that. We can afford that over a period of time. But what we don't have is we don't have the money in the bank account to pay for it. Right? So, okay, so where are we going to get that from? Dave, you want to write a check for $3 million? You want to secure a loan for $3 million? Okay. So we're gonna figure out ways to make that work, all right? But again, it can't happen until I know what we're dealing with. Okay? And I think this board knows how to do it. I think this board knows what they're doing. Okay? But we're not there. We wanna look at it, finalize alternatives, right, for us to be able to vote on. And then we will vote on it, all right, based on the projects that we can approve, because let's just look at these for a second. These are not all voting items, okay? There's a difference between a capital expense, something that you buy, that you get to expense over time because it lasts for a long time, and a capital improvement. Capital improvement is I'm going to do something to change something that makes our building better for whatever reason. And capital improvements, we vote on. Capital expenditures, we don't necessarily vote on, okay? Because if the HVAC units on the rooftop on July 6th of 2023 fail, do you think that the board has to convene a special meeting to vote to give you air conditioning within the week? Or does the board have to wait for you guys to vote as to whether or not you want air conditioning? And so that's a simple capital expenditure that we are authorized to do. It's an emergency, we gotta fix it. We'll take it from the reserve to do that, okay? But what we have to do here is we have to be clear before we can present something to you. What are the capital expenditures versus what are the capital improvements? So we need help, all right, determining what is what so that we can put the right things in front of the folks to vote in a special meeting. And that's what we'll do. Okay, so it's not just as simple as, oh, gee, look, here's a number, and oh, gee, look, here's a cost. Because we're gonna have to go to the market in some way and figure out how to get the upfront money to deliver the improvements and the expenditures that we need to deliver.
Okay, so a little background on this subject. The bylaws state that the non-resident board members are entitled to a payment each month in which the owner residents are to vote on the amount in which they receive. That happens to be currently $400 a month and has been the same amount since 2014. The non-resident board members receive a 1099 and have every year, unless they received a credit against their bill, and as of 2021, they now also receive a 1099 for amount that they're being paid for. The practice that started some time ago by a board unknown, because I could not find any votes in the minutes, was that the owner residents received a credit for their meals, TV service, and telephone service on their monthly bill. Now, in the income statement, you can see under the professional fees board of directors, that's where you see the outside board members expect to show up. The credit that the owner residents were receiving, the meals, TV service, and telephone service, was going against the revenue. It's just decreasing, so it's already in the income statement. So fast forward to November 2022. As we didn't plan to have a bylaw change, but in one of the recent Meet the Candidate meetings, it was brought to our attention that a practice that had been occurring for 15 years and probably longer concerning the owner-resident board members was possibly not validated. I personally am the one that heard this statement, so I immediately started to dig into it. I went through amendments, previous minutes, previous owner-resident board statements as far back as our accounting system would allow. And then I finally turned to our HOA attorney for counsel for clarification. Our HOA attorney stated that we did need a bylaw change in order for this practice to continue. And so that's what brings us to having the bylaw amendment that you have received. We thought it fair that all the board members receive the same amount per month. However, the owner residents cannot receive cash, so they would receive their form of payment as a credit to their bill, and likewise with the outside owners, they will also receive a 1099. You can read through the bylaw amendment. Everybody has their own opinions, but at the end of the day, the board works hard for the community, and I'm going to address a question why I'm standing here, because there was a question I saw come through earlier as who went through this, why it wasn't talked about in previous board meetings. is because this just came up in November. So our HOA attorney said you can't just throw a bylaw amendment out there at any time during the year. You've got to present it at the annual meeting. You can't call a special meeting for a bylaw amendment. So that is why it was sudden, and it's up to you to vote. And now I'll turn it over to Scott to talk about the declaration consent change.
Sorry, I was out of water.
The board has, you see this up here, and actually the idea of a buy-in, if you will, is very, very common amongst condominium units. The fact that it occurs is designed to increase the revenue that goes into the reserve fund. And of course, we've heard a lot about reserve fund this afternoon, and we know that we need to increase it to cover the expenses that we know are coming. So this was another technique to buy into the reserve fund. If we had this in place during this year, we would have added to the reserve fund an additional $109,535. That represents 2% on the sale units of the various condos. If we break it down, we have four studios that sold, and they averaged $85,350 each. 2% on that was $1,707. So that's what would have been additional on that purchase at closing. 18 one-bedrooms sold for an average of $157,528. That would have been an additional $3,150.56 that would have been applied at closing to each one of those units. 9 two-bedrooms, they sold on an average of $255,544. Each one of those units, 2%, would have been $5,110.88. So we overall would have added basically $110,000 to our revenue. Now, people buy here at Mount Vernon to live here. They come to rent here. They want to live here. We don't normally think about this place as a place where we're trying to make an investment and get a return. We're trying to buy in here and live here, whether you're renting or whether you're buying. If you go to a apartment style complex like Lynbrook or one of the others that are owned by a large company, you will pay up front a fee, a large fee, and you will get maybe a 90% return on it, depending upon what particular what particular program you took. You may get a 50% return on that, and I'm talking about return of the original money, not a profit of 50%. You will get lucky if you get half your money back on some of these places, maybe 90% back. So here, we're taking a very small percent, 2%, adding it to the reserves, and that way, that kind of comes up to what you as owners have already paid in. Because right now, we have $1.4 million, and if you divide that $1.4 million out, you come up with this million, with this, what is it, I forgot offhand already, $4,800. That $4,800, each one of you already has, on an average, the 2 bedrooms have a little more than the studios, okay? That's the way it works. But $4,800, each one of us has already paid into that reserve, already has a claim on it. So the new people coming in then are going to put in 2% of what their purchase price is. So this is a good way to increase the reserves on a one-time basis and still get us to do some of the capital improvements we need to make.
In closing, just to go over what the board recommendations are one more time, is one, to approve the 5.5% HOA due increase. As I have stated, that will allow us to cover the operational expenses and half of our reserve commitment as well as allow us to double our capital reserve from 2021. Consent to the one-time initiation fee that Scott just discussed, which is 2% of the gross sales or tax assessed value. Those funds will deposit directly into the capital reserve account. And also a reminder for the third statement that a special meeting will be called in the first quarter of 2023 to vote on the 5-year capital funding. That is not part of the voting at the annual meeting. Important dates and information to remember. The annual meeting will be December 12th at 7 p.m. with check-in beginning at 6 p.m. in the back lobby. If you designate your proxy to someone, they must be present at the annual meeting in order for it to count. If you turn in a proxy and you show up at the annual meeting, your proxy will be thrown out and you will be given a ballot. Also, as a reminder, if your account is in arrears at the annual meeting, you will not be permitted to enter and cast a vote.